talking about journeys, destinations, culture, adventure, gear, conservation, and all the things we haven't yet thought of. This episode is brought to you by Kuckuck, the compact mobile home in a box. Designed and manufactured in Germany, the patented Kuckuck camping module is perfect for those free-spirited and spontaneous travellers who need the diversity of a daily driver, workhorse and a mobile home while maximising the versatility of a single vehicle. Ideal for a wide selection of estate cars, vans and 4x4s, Kuckuck combines a kitchen, double bed and storage space all in one box. Simply place Kuckuck in your boot and the mini mobile home is good to go in just a couple of minutes. For more information, visit their website kuckuck.info. That's spelled QUQUQ.info. A link can be found in the description below. Joining me today is Sam Watson, Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and a member of the Royal Institute of Navigation. Originally from the hills of northern England, Sam's first adventure into the Sahara Desert was when he was just 7 years old, and he was smitten. Since then, he's lived in various locations in Africa and Arabia, which led him to mapping areas of the Sahara, Kenya, and the Middle East. He's worked in desert search and rescue, as well as conservation projects, including the Kenya Wildlife Service and Born Free Foundation. But if you were to ask him what really makes him happy, well, he'll tell you it's overlanding in one of his trusty Land Rovers. If you'd like to see more of Sam, he can be found on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Links to his accounts can be found in the description below. I think we've plenty to talk about today, so let's see where the conversation takes us. So, welcome, Sam.
Thank you, Mike. Hello.
We've got quite a lot to talk about today, so I think without drawing it out too long, let's kick off with Land Rovers, and maybe you can tell me a little bit about how you actually got into Land Rovers, because I've seen all your pictures on your Instagram and everything, and you seem to have had, or you've seemed to collected several over the years. But where did it all begin?
Gosh, well, I suppose I was a kid in the 70s, and in the 70s, I was, exposed to things like Born Free on the TV and Daktari on the TV, where Land Rovers were used as a means to an end, and they were used to sort of get out into the wild parts of Africa and do useful things. And this was a kind of juxtaposition with my childhood here in the village where I'm living, where it was a farming village, and it was halfway between 2 or 3 large Air Force bases and a couple of army bases. And as a result, every sort of third vehicle was a Land Rover, whether it was green or blue or full of hay bales and dogs or whatever. And so Land Rovers were always part of my sort of consciousness. And as I got older and, I was lucky enough to have parents that sort of encouraged me to live an outdoor life and camping and one thing and another. And as I got older, I thought, what's the best way to see the wilder parts of the world? And parents I was, again, lucky. Parents took me traveling, went to Egypt, went to Greece, went round bits of Europe before I was about sort of 10. And things started coming together in terms of a child who was growing into someone who wanted to travel around to remote places, realized they probably couldn't do it for sufficient distances with a car or on foot in the time available. So a bike or on foot for the time available. So a car had to be involved. And as I say, Born Free and Daktari introduced Land Rovers into the mix. And then, bizarrely, in the grounds of my primary school, they arranged one day for a visit from a police motorway Range Rover. And this Range Rover rolled in, and the very indulgent police officers let a dozen very excited small children crawl all over this Range Rover, and they sort of, pulled all the cones out and pulled all the warning signs out and pulled all this, that, and the other out, and of course switched the lights on and the siren on. It's very exciting. And then we all went away, wanting Range Rovers. And I remember my art lessons after that. I was drawing a plan of my Range Rover, and the bed will go here and the fridge will go here and blah, blah, blah. And that was it really. And so as a kid, I had ideas of heading out and seeing the interesting places in the world with a Range Rover initially. And then I realized, Range Rover is actually not particularly big inside. Maybe Land Rover's better off, certainly for, long trips in remote areas where you need fuel and heavy amounts of fuel, large amounts of fuel. This was existing in parallel with increasing numbers of trips to Egypt as a kid. And I remember standing on top of the Temple of Dendera on the Nile, on the roof, I was about 12, looking out into the desert and thinking, I wonder what's out there, let's try and find a way to get out there. And so all this came together and ended up with going through the sort of formative years of my life thinking, I'd like to get out into the world, into the remote parts of the world in a Land Rover. And then, the madness began.
Indeed. So you saw sort of like that must have been series 2s or whatever on TV to begin with.
Yeah.
And then your first proper encounters with the police Range Rover, which of course is quite large, hugely different to a series model. So what was your actual first purchase?
Initially, a long story short, I trained after various career options didn't work out. I then trained as a teacher, as a science teacher, and I got a job in York teaching at a primary school, and simultaneously got a job teaching evening classes, teaching teachers in the evening classes, because during the 90s, there was a distinct difference between teachers who knew about the internet and knew about Windows computers and knew about all that sort of generation of stuff, and those that didn't. And there was this yawning gulf between the two types of teacher. And so York City Council stepped in and said, right, we want to train up the more, what you might call more senior version, the more senior generation of teachers, to tell them about how to use Word, how to use PowerPoint, how to use the internet and bring them all together. And I was in the right place at the right time. And so I ended up first teaching and then organizing and running the training for this. And one thing led to another, and I was able to pull together the cash for an ex-military winterized 2.5 non-turbo diesel. Technically, it wasn't the Defender because it was made in about 89, 90. So it was before the Defender name came in. But I mean, it is the Defender for all. So,
that's what they used to call the 110, wasn't it?
Exactly. I can hear purists sort of sucking their teeth as I say this, but it was a 110, but it's now got Defender badges on it. And that was the start. And I bought it from a fantastic bloke called Mark Peterson down in the Midlands, who really started to, he was selling ex-MOD Defenders, then he went on to ex-utility Defenders, and then he specialized in Series 1. And I think he just more or less packed his bags and shut up shop this last year. But he sold me a low mileage ex-army winterized 110 and sprayed it white because it was obviously military green. It had literally just come out of service in the Balkans, actually, with commando helicopter support, I think it was. So extremely low mileage and serviced to death, and had done very little. And I, having been to Egypt several times as a tourist, and thought, I really like this. I really like the desert, the whole, Middle Eastern, North African carry on. I thought, right, I'm taking this to Morocco. So I asked Mark to spray it white. I put a bull bar on it and a winch on it, and went to York as a city is very lucky because it has an enormous car boot sale every Saturday morning. And 25 years ago, it still did. And so I equipped the car for this trip at a car boot sale, paying, few quid for tools, few quid for ex-army tarpaulins to sleep under. There were some, I don't know how on earth they got to be there, but there were some PSPs, some PS steel plate, the sort of de facto desert recovery plates that are used by many. They were there for about $5 each or something crazy. And so for very little, and I found an aluminium roof rack, very knackered looking, from a Sherpa van, which by chance fitted the 110. And again, that was a paid peanut. And so had equipped this vehicle on a shoestring for Morocco, drove off to Morocco in it, just with a pile of maps, really, and with a very basic GPS that, with my friend using his GPS, but he didn't know how to use it and it didn't work properly anyway. And it was fantastic, and I loved it. And it was a complete vindication of childhood dreams of African travel and Land Rovers and the idea of traveling free as the wind, as it were. And I thought, I've got to have more of this. I've got to have more of this. And that started everything, really. Very lucky to have the opportunity, and everything came together and it worked.
Well, that's a good way to start, isn't it? Is this particular vehicle the one you call Elsa?
It is.
It is. So, well, she's still around then.
Oh, very much. No, I'll not get rid of her. I mean, I forget. I think it had something like 60,000 kilometers on the tacho, on the Speedo, when I bought her. Because she'd done very little. As I say, one operational deployment in the Balkans, and that was about it. And now she's got over 400,000. But it's a bit like Grandad's axe or Trigger's broom. There's a lot of replacements and a lot of modifications and a lot of fiddling gone along in those sort of 25 years, and in those 300 and odd thousand kilometers, there's been a lot of alterations. And as you expect, stuff wears out, so you can replace it. But yeah, no, she's very much still there. She's sitting probably about 100 feet away from me and waiting for the next trip.
Oh, that's good. Just listening to what you were saying at the very beginning, you said it was a winterized vehicle.
Yes.
And you went off to Morocco into hot areas.
Ideal for the Sahara. Absolutely, yes.
Isn't that a slight clash of concepts?
Completely. I just opened the window. Yeah. To make the trip more affordable, I said to two friends, I'm going to Morocco. Do you want to come? And they said, oh yeah, all right. And I asked them, I think, to chip in 500 pounds a piece or something, or 250. Oh, I forget. Not a great deal. And neglected to tell them that it was a winterized vehicle. And the winterized spec meant that the engine coolant water was rerouted, firstly through the battery compartment, secondly through the rear passenger compartment, in a series of big copper radiators, which obviously was very good for engine cooling, but was not particularly good if you're in 40 degrees of ambient heat in the middle of the Sahara and bowling along in full sunlight in the middle of the desert. And only when we got to, I think, south of Mazuga, and my friends were saying, bloody hot in the back here. Where's it so hot? And I said, oh, didn't I tell you that bit? So yeah. So windows were opened. But it was doable. It was doable. And the system survived actually for another 7 or 8 years until, with abrasion from grit and bashing around from boxes and stuff, one of the copper pipes sprang a leak on an Italian motorway. And I had to find a local mechanic to braze the copper pipe closed. But it was a simple system, but a very good system, especially if you're in Norway, which I wasn't. But anyway, yeah.
So when you bought the vehicle, okay, you had it prepared and you got all your bits and pieces at the car boot sale. How much did you actually know about the mechanics of it? Because, I mean, you do a lot of exploration. You get away from, let's say, urban safety.
Yes.
What's your sort of mechanical experience been? And, have you been learning a lot as you've gone along, or did you prepare properly and do the right thing?
I should have done. At the time, it was essentially zero. I mean, we've always been as a family, we've always been a family that tinkers about with cars. And so we have two old Morris thousands, Morris minors, whatever. And the family has always had a sort of mindset of dive under the bonnet and fiddle about, So it's never been a particularly alien world to me, even though I didn't know very much about it. I knew the basics, and I had a basic set of. You see, the thing was, at the time, my uncle worked for Colchester Garrison, the army garrison down in Essex, and he was in charge of the workshops there. And so he'd given me a basic understanding of simple engines, simple Land Rover engines. In theory, no practical sort of idea. But luckily, the 2.5 litre diesel, and the engine that replaced it, the 200 TDI, are very solid engines, and they tend to break. And so I have learnt as things have gone along. But touch wood, so far, fortunately, haven't actually needed to do significant mechanical work in the middle of nowhere. And whenever there has been an issue, the vehicle's always got me back to somewhere where, somebody with more brain cells than me could bash them into shape again.
That's reliability for you.
Yeah, I find them very reliable. As I've said to several people, if Land Rovers were unreliable, I'd be dead.
That's one way of putting it, yes.
Because I do, part of the reason I do this is I love remote places, and I go out, I shouldn't do, but I go out and repeatedly do this with different Land Rovers, go out in a single vehicle, with me on my own, into the middle of the desert, in the knowledge that the car will bring me back. And it has. Each of them have. So, yeah. I wouldn't particularly want to drive something out there with lots and lots of computers in it, but that's a different story.
Not. Very much on your side there. I'll tell you what, let's just digress a little bit, or just move away from ELSA for a short while, because, again, I'd sort of refer to your social media accounts. There are an awful lot of other Land Rovers in your life.
Yes.
I mean, you've got a camel trophy as well, I believe, haven't you?
I had two at different times, both of which I had to sell because of different circumstances. I had an original 97 event camel trophy, which I had for 2 or 3 years, and used it in the UK. But the trouble was, it was dying from the rear underbody rot that kills Discovery ones in the UK. And I had to sell it to somebody who could restore it, because at the time I couldn't afford to restore it. So that got moved on. And then recently I've been living in the Gulf, in the UAE, and I had what's called, and I bought it locally, what's called a Camel Trophy Edition, which was a factory built, I suppose, wannabe camel. It looked like a camel. It had the camel paint and the camel wheels and this sort of thing, but it had a V8. I suppose in deference to the Gulf market, it had a V8. And a few, they didn't have the big roll cage, for example. So it was halfway to being a camel without fully being a camel, but it looked like one. And that I kept for 7 years, I think. Loved it to bits. Wanted to bring it back to the UK, and ideally wanted to overland drive it back to the UK. But then reality kicked in and said, well, this car, fully laden, does 14 miles per gallon. And I'm sorry, that should be in litres per kilometre, but I can't do that. Not in that habit, or kilometres per litre. Yeah, it was thirsty. It was thirsty. And because it was an automatic V8, and it was built for a market where fuel was cheap and plentiful. And when I sort of put my real world head on and said, well, okay, you've got to drive this from a part of the world where fuel is cheap and plentiful through Europe in sort of increasingly exorbitant fuel prices, you're going to end up paying thousands to get this back to the UK, and then running around in the UK in a vehicle which is impractically thirsty as well. So I had to I had to bite the bullet and I had to sell it in the Gulf. Because at the time I had a Discovery 2 here that would do exactly the same job as the Camel. But it was newer and it was less thirsty and it was more practical. So yeah, unfortunately that had to go, but that was a lovely thing. That was a lovely thing. It was very good and desert, soft sand. It was lovely.
So the Discovery Camel lookalike has now disappeared. What other models do you own at present?
When I sold my genuine Camel, as it were, in the UK, I was expressing frustration that it was hard to find a vehicle of the same spec without paying crazy money for it because it was a Camel trophy. And Ben Stowe at Blackpool 4x4 had just built a Discovery 2 with a Discovery 1 engine and running gear and interior, trying to get the best of both worlds. And he said, well, apart from the electric windows, this is probably as good as you'll get. And so I ran that for a while as a runabout in the UK and an overland truck. I took it through the Balkans to Albania and also into the Moroccan Sahara. I had to move that on in literally, 5 or 6 months ago because my aging parents couldn't get into it. So I had to buy a Freelander instead. And that does a sort of daily drive job now. There is a 110 soft top, which is built of the bits left over from when I stretched Elsa from a 110 into a 130. And the bits left over from that conversion were turned into a 110 soft top. But that really is not being used. It's not very practical for what I would want it for. It would be fine to potter about as a summer car if I had the money to run it, as well as the 130 and the Freelander. But it doesn't have the opportunity at the moment, so it's going to need to move on. And then I had the opportunity, probably, time moves on, doesn't it? Probably about 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Zimbabwe and have a look around Zimbabwe. I mean, I've had a kind of love affair with Africa for a long time. But, of course, Africa these days is subject to market forces like anywhere else. So if you go on safari in Kenya or Tanzania or to a lesser extent Uganda or South Africa, Namibia, that sort of thing, you pay a lot of money because, it's a significant part of the country's revenue. Zimbabwe hasn't had that issue yet. I say yet because its economy is not doing particularly well, but it's perceived as a difficult place to go to, a difficult place to travel in, and so a lot of people don't. So anyway, I sort of traveled to and around Zimbabwe and loved it and thought the place and the people were fantastic. Went back and then went back again. And then a friend said, well, like a lot of places in Africa, Zimbabwe was more or less run on Land Rovers for years. And because its economy is not in a healthy way, and by extension, the population are not particularly possessing lots of spare money at the moment. There's lots and lots and lots of series Land Rovers and to an extent Defenders and Range Rovers and some Discoveries around Zimbabwe that are in not being used because people can't afford the parts. And to an extent can't afford the fuel. Consequently, you can pick up Series 1, Series 2, Series 3s for much less than you would pay in most other places. And so I did. I bought a Series 1 and I bought a Series 2A at different times, and by happenstance found people to restore them and sort of not just restore them, but make them fit for everyday, use in the bush. And so I'm in a very fortunate position now to have two long wheelbase series Land Rovers waiting for safari use in Zimbabwe. So a very long answer to your short question. There's two series trucks in Zim, 130 here, Freelander here, 110 here, which something needs to happen to it. And also I have a Discovery 3 in Muscat, which is a bit of a funny one, in Muscat, the capital of Oman, because a couple of years, 4 years ago, a British friend was repatriated from Muscat to the UK for medical reasons. And he just moved there from Dubai with his Discovery 3, which was his everyday car and his desert car. And he contacted me because he was the guy that sold me the Camel Edition Discovery. And he contacted me and said, look, I've got this Disco 3 in Muscat. I can't use it because his medical issue was to do with his eyes. So even if he was able to ship it back to the UK, he may not be able to drive it. And consequently, subsequently, he got a job in Singapore anyway. So he couldn't export the D3 to Singapore. So there was this Disco 3 sitting in Muscat. And he said, do you want it? And I, yeah. And so I ended up with a V6 Discovery 3 in pretty good condition. And because it's Muscat, which isn't dry, it does have the monsoon. It is, it's a coastal city, but it doesn't have the amount of wet or rust and wetness issues that European Discovery 3s suffer from. And so it's, very much a going concern. And even, just by coincidence today, I've been trying to sort out the paperwork to get it up and running and in some condition to be used in some country or other. Because throughout the time I owned it when I was living in the Gulf, there were various paperwork hazards to do with Omani and UAE bureaucracy that stopped me from actually using it. And it's a very long story, which I won't go into, but this thing is sitting in a locked car park in Muscat, and our friends turn it over, or rather start the engine and drive it around the car park every week. And it runs well, and it's itching to be used, and I'm itching to get my hands on it. But, it's an ongoing issue at the moment.
You have a widespread collection.
Beyond the bounds of practicality and sense, I think.
I must admit a story about Zimbabwe. That's grabbed my attention because you said you've had 2 vehicles restored and repaired.
Yes.
What are the climatic conditions down there, and how's that affected the cars over the years?
Essentially, it's very dry. I mean, it's not a coastal state. It's completely landlocked, so it doesn't have any salt corrosion issues from sea air. It does, of course, have seasonal rains, but the rainwater that falls evaporates sufficiently quickly that it doesn't damage vehicles with rust too much. And so although there has been and is, if you find vehicles around in Zimbabwe, and I've been out and looked and done this, there is, surface rust on some of the vehicles. It's only surface rust. It's not significant component rust like in bulkheads or chassis or anything else. And so you can find vehicles that are very amenable to being restored, are in structurally very good condition, whose engines need a bit of attention because maybe they haven't been looked after particularly well, or non-Land Rover parts have been used to make it run, or they have significant odd histories that mean they need attention before they can be run. So you might have ones that have explosives or firearms left in them, or bullet holes left in them from the wars that affected Zimbabwe. But these vehicles are out there, and they are very amenable to being bought and restored and used. And very, very sadly, the biggest danger for these trucks now is there is a large amount of Chinese, how can I put this, Chinese investment in Africa, Chinese economic exploration of different countries in Africa. And part of that is the voracious acquisition of scrap metal by Chinese scrap metal dealers who find whatever scrap they can and melt it down into aluminium, steel, whatever, and then reuse it. And so you find series Land Rovers whose body parts have been chopped up for aluminium and melted down, or steel and melted down. And perfectly good vehicles and historically very significant vehicles. I mean, there is a substantial likelihood that some of the original 1948 prototypes went out to Rhodesia, as was, which is now Zimbabwe, for testing before Land Rover was released onto the market. Nobody knows anything about them, and they weren't brought home. But, this kind of history and these vehicles are being lost because of current circumstances. They're very amenable to being used, very amenable to being restored. Yeah.
All right. Right, I'm going to wheel back again, back to Elsa, your most travelled vehicle. And as you just mentioned a moment ago as well, it's one which you've done an awful lot to her over the years.
Yes.
And the most significant and most recent modification was literally to stretch her from 110 to 130.
Yes.
But even then, you sort of changed the chassis configuration as well.
Yes.
What made you do that? I mean, you travelled, let's say, 300 and something thousand kilometers as a 110, and then you had the idea to make it bigger.
You see, I sort of existed in two worlds for a while. I've existed as an overland traveller, quote unquote, based in the UK with Elsa the 110, but also living a parallel life, initially in Cairo, where I lived for 10 years and had a 110 there, well, two 110s there. And then moving to the Gulf, where I had, as I mentioned, the Discovery. So I had to sort of maintain two sets of vehicles, or two worlds of vehicles, and be aware of their requirements in each place. And I came back from, trying to think, what was the last significant trip? It was Morocco. Yes, I came back from Morocco in 2010 with Elsa and had gearbox issues because it was the original gearbox from 1989. 1989, and it let go in Casablanca, and I pulled into Casablanca and had a gearbox replacement and that sort of thing, and then drove up from Casablanca to York, where my home base is, and Ben, my friend who looks after my vehicles, said she needs either a rebuild or replacing or something, because 300,000 kilometers on top of what the military did to her, she's feeling her age now. And I thought, that's absolutely fair. And the engine, because the gearbox that went in worked, but it wasn't in its first flush of use. So I was thinking, gearbox needs doing, engine needs doing, chassis needs significant welding. Yeah, she was feeling her age, and she was 1990 to 2000, so 30 years old. And it hadn't been an easy 30 years. The military had pounded her around, although not for a huge mileage, but they'd certainly asked her to work hard. And then I did the same. And so I was sort of confronted with this big question. What do I do? What do I do to find a vehicle that I continue to use, continues to be sufficiently reliable to use, for example, solo in the desert? And do I replace Elsa or what? And then I sort of thought about, what's available, what's available both new and used. And I don't want something that's got electronics in it, because I don't know anything about them and I can't fix them, and they're not viable. I could buy another ex-military vehicle. In the back of my mind, there is always a sort of not quite sentimental push towards Land Rover, but the idea that, I'd always wanted a Land Rover as a kid, and Land Rovers never let me down, and I'm very happy with them, so I'll carry on with Land Rovers. Thanks very much. And other things on the same lines. So I thought, well, do I buy something else, or do I modify what I've got or repair what I've got? And it would have to be a pretty substantial, repair stroke rebuild to carry on batting away with a 30-year-old vehicle. And then it was at this point that Ben Stowe at Blackpool said, well, why don't you stretch it to a 130? Because I'd muttered in the past about the inability to carry passengers safely, not safely, inability to carry passengers comfortably, because the back body the load bay, as it were, is all kitted out as a place to sleep and a place to live. It's not a place to carry passengers. So, for example, I've been driving through Ngorongoro in Tanzania, not in Elsa, but in a similar vehicle, in a hardtop 110 with only 2 seats. And they initially hadn't wanted to let me in because there wasn't, because I was there with my girlfriend. They hadn't wanted to let me into the crater because they said, "Oh, you've got to have a ranger in the vehicle with you, and there's no space for the ranger to sit." And eventually I managed to persuade them, that it was okay. But this sort of issue made me realize the desirability of having another pair of passenger seats. But I wasn't going to compromise on having the rear living space. So Ben said, "Well, why don't you just put an extra row of seats in and make her a 130? So yes. And I had a friend at the time that had been trying to persuade me to buy his ex-utility 130 for a while. And I'd had it on long-term loan. And because of UK legality, I mean, for example, I know of one 110, which I think is probably the vehicle that's crossed Africa the most times. It's done at least 9 trans-Africa crossings. It left the UK in the 90s at a 90, got to Nairobi, and it was stretched into a 110. And subsequently, that was the truck I borrowed and took to Ngorongoro. But it was stretched by welding a section of chassis into the 90s chassis to turn it into a 110. But you can't do that in the UK. They won't allow it. It's not safe. And so for me to stretch Elsa from a 110 into a 130, I had to effectively buy a donor vehicle, take all the bodywork off, and drop it onto the donor vehicle chassis. And that's what I did. And so, yes, she now has a 300 TDI engine rather than the 200 TDI that I put in the mid 2000s to replace the original 2.5 non-turbo. And a 130 chassis. So yes, and she it's a bit like driving an aircraft carrier, but you get used to it. And because of tweaks and twiddles on the engine, she's actually faster and more economical than she was when she was a 110 with a 200 TDI. So it worked out very well.
In the past, you've obviously done a lot of traveling with Elsa. When you stretched her,
yes,
what other modifications did you make to the vehicle? Because you've got your spare tire on the very back now, haven't you?
Yes.
As far as I remember.
Yes.
So that must have meant a chassis modification.
Yes, the chassis that went on was from a 130 crew cab. And there is no... on a 110, as you know, the rear cross member is right at the back of the vehicle. So if you want to mount things on the back of the vehicle, like, for example, a spare tire carrier, that's fine because your rear cross member is there and you can use it because it'll take a lot of weight. But on the 130 crew cab chassis, there isn't an equivalent cross member in that place at the back of the vehicle. So Black Paw had to build a section of an extension of the chassis, which actually didn't lengthen the vehicle, but it brought a second rear cross member, and it mounted the rear cross member as if it was a 110 at the back of the vehicle. And then we custom built a swing away rear wheel carrier to go on the back of the vehicle as there had been one on the 110. The reason I did it was twofold. I prefer in the desert to have 2 spares. Well, not just in the desert, but in remote areas to have 2 spares. So there's a spare on the nose and the sort of traditional Land Rover bonnet mounted spare, and then there's a spare on the back. But also, having been running around in parallel to this, running around the Egyptian desert for a significant chunk of time with a 110 with a rear wheel carrier on it, and again, 2 spares, I'd fallen in with a group of friends living in Cairo, a group of expat friends, and we had between us, I think, 7 or 8 Defenders that were all used for desert trips. And we'd evolved, or rather, my Canadian friend Darryl had evolved the design of a wheel carrier which had a single spare wheel on it. In most cases, a high lift bracket, a high lift jack bracket on it, and also a space for 2 jerry cans for fuel. Because obviously, if you're on an unsupported desert trip for 2 weeks, you need all the fuel space you can get. And I thought this would be ideal to try and replicate in the UK. So, although it is, I believe, illegal to drive in the UK with fuel carried either on the front or the back of the vehicle, I don't fill the jerry cans in the UK. There is the ability to carry 2 jerry cans on the back wheel carrier as well, which obviously has all sorts of knock-on issues to do with length of lever and pivots and loads on the rear crossmember and all that sort of thing. So that was carefully thought about. But yes, there's a spare on the nose and there's a spare on the back, and there's 2 jerry cans on the back as well.
Did you also fit a large tank anyway?
Yes. I was lucky enough to get hold of, when she was a 110, I was lucky enough to get hold of an underseat tank from a British Army SAS Desert Patrol Land Rover. These have all been cut up and broken up, and they were never allowed to be sold on the civilian market because obviously they're, hush hush and all that sort of thing. A couple did manage to find themselves around on the civilian market through various reasons, but a lot of the components subsequently became available on a kind of, depending on who you know, kind of basis. And these fuel tanks from these vehicles, because the vehicles were V8s, predominantly V8s, the fuel tanks were filled with a kind of aluminium mesh to supposedly lessen the chance of explosion if they were hit by bullets. And so I have one of these fuel tanks under the seat. Which is it's basically the same size as an original 90 or short wheelbase fuel tank. That's under the seat. That's switched over by an electric pump. So you can there's an electric pump mounted above the tank, so you can use the pump to move fuel from the military tank into the main tank. I've been very wary about fitting extra tanks though, because I did wonder about putting one in the rear with rear wheel arch as well. But the trouble is, if you get, and everybody gets stuck in the desert, I don't care how often you've been doing it. At some point, you will get stuck. You will be either tired or you'll misread the sand conditions or whatever. Everybody gets stuck in the desert, and the heavier vehicle you've got, the more you'll swear when you try and get it out. And if you've got fuel tanks that are built into the vehicle that are full of, because obviously, every liter of fuel is about a kilo. If you've got 100 and odd extra kilos of fuel in your vehicle, 100 and odd extra kilos of weight to bother about, that makes it harder to get out. So in many ways, it's easier to carry your spare fuel in jerry cans, because if you get stuck, you just pull the jerry cans out of the vehicle and the vehicle becomes lighter and therefore easier to unstick. Yeah. So I haven't fitted too many big interior tanks to Elsa, although in the past I have done on other Land Rovers. But so that was a handy modification, because obviously like a wheel arch tank, it's dead space. It's not really space that's used for anything under the seat.
You travel a lot in the desert, and deserts are very, very hot. So have you done anything to engine cooling, bigger radiator or anything similar to that?
Yeah. There's when series Land Rovers were the vehicle of choice for engineers, explorers, travelers in the tropics, that sort of thing, there were a lot more available modifications for tropical use than there were recently with what's now being called the classic Defender, and certainly, in terms of what is available for the present Defender. One of the things that I tried to replicate was, again, Ben Stewart Blackpool, not me. He's the brains behind the sort of mechanical part of it all. he asked us, a radiator specialist, to build effectively a tropical spec radiator, which has an extra layer of cooling core, an extra core, as it were, for cooling, which increases engine cooling. I added a big intercooler, or we added a big intercooler to lower engine temperatures and increase the turbo performance. But the positioning of the intercooler was, of course, interesting, because if you get the intercooler, if the intercooler's in the wrong place, it can slow down or obstruct air to your radiator. And so the positioning of the intercooler was just, something needed thought. It's an ongoing thing. I'm possibly going to add a 12-volt fan as well as the viscous fan for engine cooling. But I haven't taken her into the desert yet. So her first desert trip in this new configuration is going to be as much of anything a test trip, just to see how everything works out. Because she's obviously big and heavy and running on wider tires than she used to do, so more rolling resistance, all that sort of thing. So I expect that there will be, continued modification.
It's one of those never-ending stories, isn't it?
Yes,
very much so.
Yes.
Okay, just on sort of the last technical bit of this part of our discussion. Radiators changed, vehicles changed length, etc. Did you have to do much, or have you done much to the suspension?
I'm just trying to remember where we're at with the suspension. When she was a 110, I was running her on heavy-duty springs and gas shocks. Gas shocks? Yes, gas shocks. And also, inside the back springs, I was running airbags made by a company called Airlift, which I'd had great satisfaction with, and subsequently installed them on the Disco 2 as well. And they work as, well, obviously, they're an airbag inside the spring, and you can inflate them to increase your ability to carry a load over rough terrain, and also lift the back of the vehicle by an inch, maybe 2 inches, depending on how you set it up. Things were great until I'd been in southern Morocco. Well, I'd actually been in Algeria, and then I crossed back into southern Morocco in a sandstorm, and there was a lot of blown sand around. And for whatever reason, I still don't really know where the sand got to, but I pulled into an oasis in the south of Morocco, having been out in this sandstorm for a couple of days, and discovered when I tried to deflate the airbags that one would deflate and the other one wouldn't. And so the vehicle was on an angle like this. And so I had to crawl underneath with a penknife and literally pop the airbag so that the vehicle would settle down to a more acceptable sort of level, for driving on the road. And I thought, well, okay, these are good things for a certain kind of use, but I don't want to put them on the 130. So on the 130, we've gone for, what was I saying? It sounds like it's a different vehicle. I hope it's the same vehicle. On Elsa now, she's got Camel Trophy spec rear springs, which are a small coil inside a large coil, and standard heavy duty springs on the front. Standard, now what did we go for? I'm trying to remember the type of shock she's got on the front. I think they're Coney heavy raid shocks on the front, but no, they're not. They're Fox. No, they're Fox. They're Fox remote reservoir gas shocks on the front. On back, there's twin shocks on either side, because there was an awareness that the weight of the vehicle had increased significantly, or potentially fully laden. The weight had increased significantly, and also that the sort of turning effect of that weight and of weight on the roof, the twisting effect on the chassis and on the suspension, on rough terrain and on strange angles like climbing a dune, for example. So we left the anti-roll bar connected on the back, even though I didn't particularly like the idea, to try and control any tendency to roll, and also put twin shocks on either side, these Fox remote reservoir shocks, twin shocks on either side, to try and control what the back body was doing under off-road conditions with a full load.
That's quite a lot of work you've put into the suspension on its own, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I've been very mindful. I was very mindful driving her as a 110 that it's a big, heavy vehicle. And if you're doing 100 kilometers an hour, especially on an unlit, potholed road, especially in somewhere like North Africa where you're going to have livestock on the road, you might have dunes coming onto the road with a toe of sand sticking across the road, or you might have enormous potholes, and the road is going to be unpredictable. If you're sailing along at 100 kilometers an hour in a big, heavy vehicle, you've got to be able to control what the vehicle does, and part of that, obviously, is the suspension. And so I had to sort of try and think, what's the worst that can happen here, and how can the suspension cope with it?
How much has the weight actually gone up, the gross vehicle weight actually gone up compared to Elsa's 110?
At the moment, not enormously, because obviously you've got the extra section of the chassis, you've got the extra section of the body, the tent. I've put a slightly bigger roof tent on, so the roof tent is probably, 10 kilos, 20 kilos heavier. And there is the rear section of the chassis. The distribution of the weight has altered because there is a longer overhang at the back now than there was with the 110, which obviously has knock-on issues when you're off-roading, because you've got a big back end that you can catch on things. So your departure angle has changed significantly. But the rear wheel carrier, and if the jerry cans are full, the jerry can holder as well, has moved the weight significantly backwards, which has a knock-on effect. There is the stability of the vehicle has potentially changed. So I've tried to balance it at the other end by moving a lot of things inside the vehicle forwards, trying to push them forwards of the axle to try and, centralize the weight. All the time I'm conscious of this need to keep the majority of the vehicle's weight between the axles and below the waistline of the vehicle, to keep the weight central and low.
Yeah.
Because, when your vehicle is tilted on a dune, or your vehicle is going down a dune or up a dune, or on a bizarre road surface, or on, rock, you need to be able to have an awareness of where the center of the weight of the vehicle is, center of gravity of the vehicle. So although the weight at the moment hasn't significantly increased, it's increased certainly a bit, probably by, I wouldn't like to say, a couple of 100 kilos maybe.
Yeah.
There is the potential for it to increase. And also it's a bit like going mountaineering with a rucksack. If you have a big rucksack, the tendency is that you still it. And
it's not a good idea.
No, correct. Exactly. Correct. And so that's the danger of a 130, especially since I do have a love of, fossils. And I tend to sort of, if I'm going back through the Atlas Mountains, I tend to pick up big lumps of rock. And I was actually pinged by the police and by British, which organization was it? It was some sort of vehicle registration authority, something. This was 2010 when I came back into the UK, and I had fossils it's 2008. I'm sorry. Came back into the UK with fossils from the Atlas Mountains in the back, and it took me over the plated gross vehicle weight for the vehicle axles. And they fined me, quite rightly. And they said, oh, we don't want to do this because we treat your vehicles great, and it's a Land Rover being used for what it should be used for. And I've got a Land Rover and all this, blah, blah, blah. But they said, we've got to do it. And I said, no, of course you've got to do it, because, it's unsafe at that weight. And, but they did, they quite rightly fined me for exceeding the vehicle, axle weight, or the specified axle weight. And so that's the 10-day, and the temptation is to sort of think, it's a big vehicle, let's chuck all this stuff in it. But of course you can't do that.
No, you've got to be a little bit wary.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I think it's fair to say you've done a lot of travelling, and you've got a wonderful base vehicle, your base camp on four wheels.
Mm.
You have something in the pipeline. You're writing a book.
Well, yes. I mean, yes, it started off as kind of quite a small scale thing, because when I was living in Cairo, I was trying to note down details of all the trips I made so that I could look back on it in 20 years' time and remember the difference between going to this place or going to that temple or going to XYZ. And, so initially it was just a pile of notes. And then, and at the time as well, I was and have been writing about desert travel and about African travel for various 4x4 magazines, and have done for 25 years plus. And so some of those notes evolved into articles. And then a friend said, well, look, why don't you write a book? And I said, well, who'd want to read it? And he said, well, people read your articles. Why don't you just put, the same sort of enthusiasm that you put in an article into a book? And so I kind of did, and it's taken a while to beat into shape, but it seems to be moving into some sort of digestible format. Yeah. So yeah, I hope. Yeah.
Well, it certainly sounds exciting. I'll tell you what. Here's an opportunity. Give us a very short description of what you have in your book. I'm sure it's going to be filled with loads of pictures, because you're always posting pictures. You must have a massive library of photographs. But give us just a sort of quick gist of what the book will have as its content, and what we can look forward to reading.
Well, that's kind of you. Thank you. What I didn't want to do was just write another travel book, because there's lots of them around, and even just another, without wanting to be sort of demeaning to anybody or anything. I didn't just want to write another desert book, because again, there's a lot of desert books around. There has been for a while, but I've been lucky in my travels to have several odd experiences which have been completely unplanned, and at the time often quite hair-raising, but with hindsight have been quite entertaining. So I got arrested as a spy in Egypt, and I got shot at in Oman by two tribal groups, and I got involved with doing wildlife ranger work in Kenya a couple of times, and chased elephant poachers, and again with gunfire and other bits and pieces. So yes, I suppose it is to an extent it's a travel book, but also I tried to call it more of an adventure travel book. So it's a bit more than just, drive from A to B and here are some lions, or drive from A to B and look, there's some pyramids. But it's sort of the frustrations of crossing from Sudan to Egypt in the desert and being shot at, and one of the party being shot through the arm, and how do we deal with the guy that did it, and how do we deal with the casualty? Or, I got arrested as a spy and ended up in an Egyptian jail, and how do I talk to the Egyptian frontier police, or rather the Interior Ministry police, and all this sort of thing. So it's not just bouncing around in a Land Rover and, oh, look, there's some lions. It's a bit more, I mean, there is that, of course, but that's the background to the actual stories themselves, which I suppose are more human interest. And I try to keep it as humorous as possible, because a lot of these situations, often with the benefit of hindsight, were ludicrous to the extent that they were quite funny. Or you sort of, you relive it in your mind, and you think, my God, did that actually happen? And how on earth did we get away with that? So my hope is that it is by turns entertaining and exciting, as well as suggesting to people that the world of adventurous travel, and I'm not, for a minute suggesting that people go out and seek bizarre experiences, but the world of adventurous travel, bouncing around on safari, is still very real. And even, here we are in the sanitized 21st century. If you go out and look for an interesting trip, you'll probably find one. Yeah. And so
Brilliant.
it is more, it's not just a travel book. There is a travel element to it, but as I say, the travel is the wallpaper to the actual events that happen. Gun runners in Algeria, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, you've certainly got something to look forward to. You've got sort of any idea when it might be published?
My hope is that, and a publisher has kindly taken on the juggling of this. My hope is it will be available for book stands at Christmas, and so people will be able to sit in the front room when it's raining outside and dream about deserts, or dream about Africa, or dream about getting out and doing something. So yeah, that's the plan. That's the plan.
So the plan for anybody who's interested then should be to follow your social media channels, and you can keep everybody up to date.
That will be exciting if they could, and we can always, as social media encourages, you can always have a dialogue amongst people and swap ideas, and people can infuse me and I can infuse them. That's the plus side. One of the plus sides of social media is, people get ideas from everybody, don't they? And swap ideas and swap experiences and swap enthusiasms.
Sam, I'm going to draw today to a close. Thank you very much for your insights and your information and talking about Land Rovers. I'm definitely going to suggest right now that we do another podcast, maybe on one of your trips, and we can sort of dive in and see where you've been, what you've actually done. But for today, yes, thank you very much for joining me. And it was great listening to you.
Thank you for tolerating it, Mike, and thank you for the opportunity to have a chat.
Thanks for tuning in to the At Overland Europe podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and download our app for more adventures and exclusive content. Remember, you can find our guest social media and websites linked in the description below. Until next time, safe travels.